Bruce, you're like all dressed up today with a tie and everything.
You missed that part.
You missed it, Said.
All right, I'll get it later.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Flow Conversation. We are going to be talking today about common language. Why is it important? What is challenging about it? And what are we trying to do here in the Flow Collective with common language? So one thing that came to mind for us, we were talking before going live, was kind of a classic example of recent years of DevOps being a term that means something different to everybody. I'm sure there's a lot of those. There's a lot of them inside of the Flow Collective. We talk about value all the time and throw it all over the place, and we talk about flow and value flowing, and it's a big mess, but we're constantly trying to arrive at some form of clarity. Anybody have any thoughts about what is so important about common language?
Well, we have this idea of we need a common language so we can understand what each other means. It's the more specific high context style languages and how we communicate, the harder it is for an outsider to come in and understand what everybody else around them is saying, which of course then leads to the culture, the tribe, and we do this naturally too. We shorten what we say, we abbreviate things, and we come up with these acronyms, and we use them to talk to each other all the time.
I think one. Sorry, go ahead, Said.
No, I was just going to say, I think common language is one of many common things that we talk about, right? Common language, common context, common goals, etc. Right? So I think it's just a component and a necessary component of working together, aligning together, and then moving forward together. And if you think of any non-work related example where you don't have common language, it ends in trouble. If you're trying to go somewhere with the family or something, people meant different things by let's go have some fun. I think common language becomes really important.
Brought up a thought for me, the classic term that common sense is uncommon, right? It's something, and it is what I was thinking of after you spoke, Peter, was this idea that we might assume that we understand the same thing, but until we ask, until we clarify, until we dig a little bit deeper, that assumption could be pulling us in different directions.
And it's interesting when you consider, like, we work in systems and not in a collection of silos. And if you work in a collection of silos, then you're not particularly interested in what other people think. But if you believe you work in a system, then by nature, that means you need to tailor your conversation to working in a system, which is assuming that communication is hard and that common language is not so common.
Yeah. So, and then following that, when you're speaking to other people who may be sort of like outside your immediate circle or people you work with like less frequently, then it's more likely that you have a mismatch between the language that you're using. And that's why it's so important to check your assumptions about what you think that you're talking about with other people, right? Because like this happens all the time, especially if you talk to QA people about automated testing versus talking to developers about automated testing. That's another good example of where two people are using the same word but have totally different expectations about what that means to what they're trying to do, or what they're trying to achieve. It's like the challenge in having a common language is also being able to detect when you're uncertain if you're communicating in the common language. Like, how do you realize that you are like that there's some assumptions that you're making that you need to verify before continuing the conversation, before you sort of end up going in two different directions.
I'm working with an organization at the moment that has an awful lot of three-letter acronyms, TLAs, and they use ones which don't which are sometimes commonly used elsewhere in the industry, but they use them for their own internal purposes. So that makes it especially hard when they're working with a third party like myself coming in, and they start to use these 3-letter acronyms, and like it means one thing to me, it means something else to them, and so I'm having to constantly double check and understand what did you actually mean by that. Can I infer by the context, or like what is it that you're actually trying to say?
It's interesting to consider what we need to do as individuals having these conversations. Humility seems to play a big part in that. Recognizing that you're not the center of the universe, and recognizing that someone has to be willing to stick their neck out and say, I don't understand what you just said. Can you explain it? Yeah.
Because like generally, like there's a power dynamic that goes along with information flow, right? So, and we kind of learned that when we were at school, you know, your teachers and parents, or the people in position of power, also in position of giving information. So using 3-letter acronyms, TLAs and so forth, to in a way that impresses others, or to obscure your meaning, or just not caring about whether somebody else understands or not, and not being willing to take the time to figure out their language, to check be sensitive to their subtle eye movements and so forth, to see if they're getting it or not, because it requires an investment from our side to learn their language, to take the time to explain things, to figure out a common language, which implies, as you say, like, do we care about them or not?
Well, hopefully we do care.
I don't think that's a foregone conclusion, but hopefully we do. Yeah, but I think it's the first thing we should check.
Yes.
I think it's the first thing we should check, because I think it's always a bit at risk, or a bit like, and how much do we really care about the other person versus trying to impress them with our language. But it reminds me a little bit of the evolution of human language, right? That humans have gone all over the world, that language naturally diverges, you know, to get different regions with their own different dialects. But as the world has converged, as we're beginning to operate in these global systems, like Chris was saying, people have converged around English as, to some degree, some common language, and technical specifications as some common language. So it's just interesting seeing the convergence and divergence based on the needs of the time. What's important.
I think, though, that so it's true, even if you speak the same, literal language, the interpretation of what is said can be completely misconstrued or misunderstood. The story I have is that, so I work in product, and the word requirement, it's one of those words, and I have a little line about it. It's that a requirement is a statement of need by a product manager, seen as a loose suggestion by development, but as a firm commitment by sales, right? And each group, I mean, it's not that they're trying to clash with each other, but each group is working in their context. And so, the terminology matters, but context matters. And then how you interact with each other matters. And I think that, it's easy to think you have a common language, but you don't have common context.
I don't see any hands up, so I'm going to jump in. One thing I think is interesting inside the context of the Flow Collective, right? We have these kind of running dialogues where we're kind of digging deeper and deeper into these concepts that we throw around, and ideas and challenges and problems. And, we have this ongoing dialogue, and we have people coming into the community all the time, right? And people come into the community with their understanding, and we want to make it easy for them to get up to speed and join us in the conversation. We also don't want to be, rehashing everything. You don't want to be reopening the patient all the time and being like, okay, well, let's start from scratch and figure out what this thing means. But, and I'm sure that would be valuable. It just seems like, you want to make progress with that understanding, right? And distill it and create a more a more cohesive sense of understanding. But we get caught all the time. Like I feel like people joining the community need all this backstory. Like, here's what we mean when we're talking about value. Here's what we mean when we talk about flow. And here's what the context can change depending on this, and this. And that is sort of like an onboarding effort that really takes care and attention. And I don't think we do a fantastic job. It's like a continuous effort to get that working.
So, like, what works in your experience? I mean, if we all agree that having common language is useful and that it's not enough to just speak, there has to be some sort of concerted effort to educate people around what the language is and what the words mean and like what all this is. Like, how do you do that beyond just having constant conversations where somebody says, I don't know what you're talking about, or like, explain this to me, or where you have to do that with every kind of person you talk to? Like, how do you bootstrap common language?
It feels like it's analogous to just the learning process. Like Steve says, new people join the group, they have to learn the language of the group. It's the same. New people come into your company, they need to learn the processes in your company, they need to learn about the technologies and so forth. So it's this ongoing struggle. And gradually, like as we learn something, we get more and more associations. You use one word as a symbol, right? Like, infrastructure, containers. You have this one word, and then you have these various associations to that word in your mind that are better or worse in terms of their detail, or more or less well defined. But there is this constant process of learning. It's not something that finishes. But language is the way that groups learn, basically. Common language is the way that groups learn, and the way that you get common symbols that you can then interchange with one another to anchor certain ideas and say, oh, containers are a really important part of infrastructure, and like, let's combine these two ideas, and everybody, if you're up to speed with that, you can make quick progress.
I think the other thing on common language, and I think it's important, and it goes back to like the TLA example that was mentioned. I worked in a company where we loved our TLAs. Like it was something that you didn't realize until somebody asked, like, what does that mean? What does that mean? In fact, one of the employees made a hilarious video about all the TLAs in the company. And one of the things, though, that was that those TLAs would spill over outside the company, and people would just use them without understanding that people outside the company don't know what they are, and honestly, most likely don't even care. And so that idea of common language is bound. You should understand that, and it's bound by some boundary, right? It might be inside a company or inside a group or inside a profession, but you have to always be conscious of the fact that those words and terms and whatever you use aren't universally understood, and especially in a business where you're talking with customers, really conscious but not taking that internal common language and forcing it outside.
So
again, I feel like there's this hidden aspect of the mindset. Do you have a mindset of inclusivity, wanting to have like a common language that everybody can get on board with, wishing to extend knowledge? Or does your language sort of secretly acknowledge that you just want to be special and you want to have this sort of insider language? So unless you look at that first, then all of the other details about language won't get addressed properly.
So it's kind of worth then asking the question of how does one, it needs to be a fast, short feedback loop, because it's something that you always have to be doing all the time. And that means that it's a personal discipline. So as a personal discipline, what does building shared understanding look like? I think this is like dovetails right into the other thing we were talking about. Go, Steve.
I'm lost on the other thing we were talking about, but I'm sure I'll catch up at some point. But the thing that I was thinking is, going back to Adam's question, I think, and what you just mentioned, like, how do we actually do it? We have sort of like a Wikipedia approach, and a lot of organizations will use sort of like a page on Confluence or something that just is just essentially a glossary. But what I'd like to see it, and I think would be really valuable for something like the Flow Collective, where we spend a lot of time in Slack, is some kind of bot where you can either add a definition or pull a definition, or issue essentially a pull request against a definition and say, like, this is great. I would actually refine this to be this phrasing, right? Or I would extend this definition or distill this definition. And then maybe, what you attach to it is a scope, right? Where it's like, this is what we mean in the context of our, internally or externally, because I think those qualifiers matter, right? Like, what does it mean to us and a team? What does it mean to an organization in a broader context? I think that would be really interesting.
The catch is having it not turn into documentation, which then just dies a miserable death, as most documentation does.
Well,
Yeah,
that's why you have to like engage with it, right? That comes back to like you need some flow of people through the system that are constantly like revisiting the material and having that, like, those definitions, or however you want to think about them, as sort of just active material in like the daily work and the conversations. Like, if people come in, they've never heard it before, they can get a quick definition. Or like, if you're in a meeting and stuck between trying to figure out what like this is, or like what can we use some of the things that we understand as, like forcing functions to come to a decision, then you coming back to the material to engage with it. So like, we need some throughput through this whole system to keep it fresh. Like, we need new people and new questions as lubrication for all of this.
I think some of the power of the documentation or a bot that helps out is that it lowers the cost. It lowers the social cost on people of asking the question, what is that acronym stand for? You just ask the bot, or you look at the glossary, but there's one common place where everybody can go. So ideally, you're not having, the conversations are not too dense with that stuff to begin with, but even if they are, everybody knows they can get their questions answered.
Well, yeah, we are running out of time for today. I would love to come back to this at some point. I really do want that bot to exist, I think, or some kind of low friction, flow focused glossary function for the community. That would be wonderful. So stay tuned for development on that. And with that, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. We'll see you next week.